Go.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe and wearing masks and reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center over all of these years. It is her vision that has made this program possible. Please note that our next event is coming up in 2 days on this Thursday, October 15th, where Victor Navasky and I will interview Larry Tye about his timely and important new biography of Joseph McCarthy. Tonight we are here, however, to celebrate the publication of Abraham Lincoln in His Times, a new biography of Lincoln by David Reynolds. Abe is just out. This is his book launch, and the book has received starred early reviews in Kirkus and Publishers Weekly and elsewhere. So we encourage everyone to look it up on Amazon or preferably your own local independent bookstore. David Reynolds is a distinguished professor at CUNY's Graduate Center. He is the author of Walt Whitman's America, a cultural biography, winner of the Bancroft Prize. His other books include Beneath the American Renaissance, John Brown, Abolitionist, and Mightier Than the Sword, Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Battle for America. He is a regular book reviewer for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, and the Wall Street Journal. David will be in conversation with James Oakes, one of the leading historians of 19th century America. James's pioneering works include The Ruling Race, 1982, Slavery and Freedom, an Interpretation of the Old South, The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and the Triumph of Anti-Slavery Politics. And his latest book, Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861 to 1865. They will have a conversation for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then take questions for 10 or 15 minutes. Please click on the question box below in your to type in your questions, and Jim will be sure to get to as many of you as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour at 7 Eastern Time. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Jim Oakes, I now turn the conversation over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you, David, for asking me to do this. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to do this because, first of all, congratulations on your book. It's a terrific book.
Thank you very much, Jim.
And congratulations on the reviews of your book. They've been terrific also.
Thank you.
David is one of my favorite cultural historians. Have we lost you? It looks like I'm...
You're good.
I'm good? Okay.
Yeah.
It looks like I lost...
No, you're fine.
Okay.
You're fine.
David is one of my favorite historians of the Civil War era and my favorite cultural historians, period. And he brings to the... That's because he brings to the study of cultural history certain virtues that aren't always present among cultural historians. First is a genuinely, awesomely encyclopedic knowledge of American cultural history, from high to low and everything in between, which is he brings to bear and shows to great effect in his various books. One of the effects of that knowledge, that vast knowledge of American cultural history, is that David has always been sensitive to the conflicts and contradictions within American culture. He doesn't tend to find a particular cultural attribute and say, this is what American culture was like. If there are racists, there are anti-racists. If there are egalitarians, there are anti-egalitarians. And all the way through, there are religious conservatives and religious radicals. And he brings that sensibility to bear also. And it shows to great effect in all of his work, including his latest book. And finally, associated with that is a kind of democratic sensibility about culture that doesn't worry very much about high culture versus low culture, and doesn't care too much about that distinction. Not that there isn't such a distinction. And it I think shapes the kind of books he writes, the kind of subjects he chooses to write about. Walt Whitman, the democratic poet, the poet of American democracy. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of a book of genuine literary value, but also enormously popular, an enormously popular book. And finally, Abe, which I think he's attracted to Lincoln for similar reasons. That he quotes on around page 718, quotes Ralph Waldo Emerson praising Lincoln for his for being attuned to all aspects of American culture, from opera and Shakespeare to frontier humor, the religious sensibilities of the age, and the like. And I think that all of those virtues show up in this marvelous book that he's given us. So let me begin by asking you a fairly simple question: What is the difference between a cultural biography of Lincoln and the kind of biographies, the best biographies by Richard Colwardine or David Donald or Michael Burlingame? Those are my favorites. So
Right.
how does it matter?
That's a great question. There have been some marvelous biographies, superb biographies of Lincoln. And what they do generally is they follow his life, sometimes his political context. There's a political biography by Blumenthal that's excellent.
Right.
But the kind of standard one volume, Michael Burlingame does such a wonderful job, but there's the David Donald kind of classic single volume biography. And Donald says in his preface, this is a biography from Lincoln's point of view, because he didn't really have too much connection to the society and culture of his era. He was self-educated. He was the ultimate self-made man. And Donald even says that he entered the presidency the least prepared of any president that we've ever had. And in a sense, I guess I'm taking really the opposite point of view. I'm taking the Emersonian point of view. Emerson said that of all the great heroes in history, Lincoln stands alone for embracing the entire realm of experience, from the very, and you mentioned this just now, from the very highest to the lowest, until the very dogs believe in him. Emerson had a certain way of writing that was like that. And Emerson felt the same way about Shakespeare too. He said Shakespeare uses all the scraps of old plays and lousy dramas and everything. Then he transforms them into something new. And Lincoln early on was a big fan of popular humor, sometimes rather dirty humor or whatever. But he also memorized very long poems by Shakespeare, by Burns. And he didn't do this to impress people at cocktail parties and, listen to my latest poem or something like that I've memorized. He did it just because these passages meant something to him. And once he read a passage a couple of times, he had it memorized. And so right in the middle of his presidency, he would break out with a long soliloquy by Hamlet or by Claudius or one of the great Shakespearean tragedies and that kind of thing. And even on April 9th, 1865, when Lee was surrendering to Grant in Appomattox, and Lincoln was on a boat going from Virginia to Washington. He had been visiting Grant, and everybody around him was cheering. And isn't this wonderful? This is great. And I guess today we would have said mission accomplished in a big banner or something. But Lincoln said, I'd rather talk about Shakespeare. I would rather talk about Shakespeare. I would rather talk about Longfellow. And they're saying, what? And he spent several hours discussing poetry from Shakespeare and Longfellow and others about death. And his mind was really on the 750,000 Americans who died in the Civil War. That's where his mind was. It wasn't, hey, mission accomplished, or I'm the greatest, or whatever like that. I'm the leader here. He was thinking about those who had died. And it's quite moving, and I think that's part of where his democracy comes from, and his ability to identify with really people of all, all classes and all backgrounds.
Right. So the book is chock full of these really interesting sides that help us understand Lincoln in the context of the culture. Sometimes how he fits into the culture, and also sometimes how he departs from the culture. Stuff about middle-class marriage, and was their marriage a typical middle-class marriage, or was it in some ways different? A really interesting section on the origins of the phrase "in God we trust" and things like that. But let me ask a few questions about the general themes, but let me start with a simpler one. Why Abe? Why not Abraham Lincoln or Lincoln?
Well, that's a great question, too, because he actually didn't like the name Abe. He didn't like it when people called him Abe. And yet he said, I wouldn't have gotten elected, would not have gotten elected without the image of Honest Abe or Uncle Abe or Old Abe. He knew that in 1860, he became beloved among the people as Abe. So it kind of feeds into my whole idea in the book about the way he identified with average Americans and the way they saw him and loved him. And so that the people around him knew that he only wanted to be called Lincoln, not even Mr. President or Abraham or anything like that. He signed his name A. Lincoln as though he was kind of saying it's a toss-up, what you call it. So he signed his name A. Lincoln, but yeah, Abe. Right. Is his identification with the common person back then. Honest
Abe.
Yeah.
Or Father Abraham, right?
Father Abraham, yeah, that was another one. But there are a lot of nicknames for him.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. So one of the themes that runs all the way through the book that I hadn't thought too much about is the cultural difference between the Puritans and the Cavaliers, right? And you develop this in terms of Lincoln's own sense of himself, as well as the culture at large, as well as the way people at the time understood the struggle in terms of a cultural conflict like that. Can you tell us all about that?
Yeah. A lot of people back then really thought the Civil War was about the age-old difference between the New England Puritans. New England early on had been settled by the generation of Puritans who were escaping persecution in England, and on the one hand, and the Cavaliers, who were the supporters of royalty in England. And when Cromwell and others came to power, Cromwell was a Puritan, they were fleeing to America and they settled in the South. So everyone, Charles Sumner to a lot of other people, were saying it's basically a fight between New England, which included an anti-slavery standpoint, by the way, and the Cavalier, which believed in kind of hierarchy and institutions, and including the institution of slavery. And Lincoln was aware of both Puritan and Cavalier, but someone at the time said the great thing about President Lincoln is that he combines the Puritan and the Cavalier. And I kind of explain that in my book because his earliest ancestor on his father's side, Samuel Lincoln, came over in 1637 and was a Puritan. And most of his descendants were Puritans. They became Baptists eventually. But on that side, he kind of runs back to Puritan New England. And on his mother's side, there was illegitimacy in the background. He wasn't really sure who his grandfather was, but he was sort of convinced it was a Virginia planter, a man of sort of aristocracy of the South, that kind of thing. So in a way, he associated with a sense of honor, that this kind of Southern sense of honor. So he had both the Puritan and the Cavalier running through him, even though he didn't want to identify either with either side, because a lot of people were saying, I'm more of a Puritan background and I'm more of a Cavalier. He really did. In fact, he chose to emphasize his Quaker background. Turns out only one of his great-grandmothers was Quaker, Rebecca Flowers. But all his biographies said, oh, he was from Quaker background. Quakers were accepted by both the Puritans and the Cavaliers. They were kind of a buffer. You would think the Cavaliers would hate the Quakers because they were anti-slavery. But no, the Quakers were also pacifists. They didn't, even during the Civil War, they were sort of conscientious. They didn't want to go to battle over opinions over slavery, even though they were morally opposed to slavery. So the Quakers were okay with the South, but they were also sort of beloved in the North. Early on, of course, they had been persecuted. They'd been hanged in early New England. But by this time, they had settled in the middle Atlantic states and Pennsylvania, and they were kind of a buffer between the Puritan and the Cavalier. And I explore in my book how Lincoln kind of emphasizes that aspect in his background.
And people at the time, I'm surprised by. Well, I shouldn't be surprised, because William R. Taylor wrote a wonderful book years ago on the Puritan and Cavalier and Yankee. It's called. But I'm surprised again to see how many people at the time actually did understand. But it wasn't just that the New Englanders understood themselves to be Puritans. They had a very they didn't like the Cavalier image, and they were not only self-images, they were actually stereotypes of each other's sections. Well, let's talk about how each section stereotyped the other.
Well, I think stereotypes can pretty easily, even in our culture, as back then, mushroom and become caricatures. And these were definitely caricatures. I mean, by the time of the 19th century, when all this was being talked about, both sections were too polyglot to be dismissed in a stereotype like Puritan and Cavalier. But that image just overwhelmed a lot of people, and they really began to believe it. And a lot of people were saying, well, the division between the North and the South can never be repaired, because there will be nothing but hate forever between the Puritan and the Cavalier. It was kind of a ridiculous point of view, but it was widely accepted,
Right.
Yeah.
And the Cavaliers saw the people who identified themselves as Cavaliers would have seen the Puritans as industrious, hardworking, but also busybodies, nosy, people,
very intrusive, trying to convey moralistic, prudish. They used to hang Quakers and burn witches and hang witches and so forth, and very also very materialistic. The Yankee, all that,
money grubbing,
and kind of lowly, people.
Right.
And
whereas the Puritan stereotype of the Cavalier is haughty, aristocratic, anti-democratic.
That's right, and idle, and making other people labor for them, enslaved people who were laboring for them. And they were the Cavaliers were on their porches, verandas, and drinking their mint juleps, and while enslaved people were working.
Right. So that theme runs all the way through the book. It's surprising how widespread that belief was at the time. I actually, just this afternoon, I picked up a book off my shelf by a prominent Southern historian named Grady McWhinney. He has a short history of the Civil War that is framed as the difference between the Puritan and the Cavalier. And so it's still there. It's still there to some extent.
It is to some degree, yeah.
To some degree. So let me ask you another theme that shows up it doesn't run all the way through, but once it shows up, it's there, and it has to do with Niagara Falls. And I remember when I was a kid, Niagara Falls loomed a bit larger in the culture than it does now. People went on their honeymoons to Niagara Falls and things like that. But in the middle of the 19th century, Niagara Falls was a huge deal, and a lot of people used it metaphorically, including Lincoln himself. But there's an incident in 1858 that also happens at Niagara Falls that becomes a metaphor that people at the time used, but also that you see as telling. So why don't you talk about those two things? How did Lincoln, or maybe you could expand on what Niagara Falls meant in 19th century American culture, what it meant to Lincoln.
Well, it was a great tourist attraction, and when Lincoln went there on the way home from Washington, he had been serving in Congress, and he stopped over in Niagara Falls and then went over the Great Lakes to back to Chicago and then to Illinois. He lived in Illinois and stopped over in Niagara Falls. He was stunned by the spectacle. And part of my book is influenced by a school of thought today called Posthumanism. And that means that the effect that nature and things, non-human things, have on people. And today, even right now, we're very much experiencing a post-human existence because we're speaking the way we do because of a thing, COVID. Where there's something out there, and in California, some people are dealing with a thing. It's called fire, and then other times, it's a hurricane or something. I used to live in California, and once in a while it was an earthquake. Something outside of us. And Lincoln was immersed from the very, very beginning in thingness, in nature. He was in a one-room log cabin, and he was just on the frontier. He totally lived off the forest and was surrounded from the very beginning by kind of savage nature. And when he sees Niagara Falls in 1848, he's just overwhelmed by the sheer energy and power of it. But it makes him think in kind of a post-human way. He says, this spectacle has been here ever since Adam, if we can believe in Adam. It has been here since ancient Rome. All the civilizations, all human beings, this has been a constant throughout history. So in a way, he was expanding backward in time, but thinking of this thing in front of him, Niagara Falls, and just saying how immense it was. And it made him think of all the people coming to view it, because at that time, as you mentioned, it was a real, nowadays, I'm not sure it's that much of a tourist attraction, but back then it was a huge thing for people to come. And all these rivers he was thinking about that ran into it and then were channeled. And part of my book is also about how he channeled so many rivers and so many streams of culture. And I'm not saying he became Niagara, but he became a channeling focus. Anyway, 10 years later, in 1858 and 1859, a tightrope walker named Blondin came. He was French, and he came and he put on a spectacle of crossing Niagara Falls many times on a tightrope, no net. And he would push a wheelbarrow across. He would carry a man on his back across Niagara Falls. He would do flips. He walked across on 4-foot stilts. He was incredible. But Lincoln said, that's me. Several times he compared himself to Blondin, right in the middle. Why? Because he was living in such a divided time that he knew the worst thing that he could do is to pour more gasoline on the flame of division, to step off that tightrope. And people would come and say, why can't you make this a more anti-slavery war from the very beginning? And he said, look, if I were Blondin, if I were carrying the entire nation's future in my wheelbarrow, would you be yelling, lean left, lean right, lean this way, lean, jump up, jump down? He said, no, you would allow me to just keep right in the middle here, because this is the best way to do it and preserve the Union. And one reason why he didn't make it more of an anti-slavery war, of course, was that he said, if we lose Kentucky, we're going to lose everything. There were border states who still had enslaved people, and yet they were loyal to the North. But he said, if we lose some of these states, we're going to lose the war. So he had to be he had to stay in his tightrope to keep those states in the Union.
Right. And sometimes the tightrope seems to be between his deep moral conviction that slavery was wrong and the need to build and then hold together a political coalition that had a lot of people who didn't share his deep anti-slavery conviction. Right? So sometimes
exactly.
it's between morality and strategy, right?
Right,
Pragmatism.
exactly. He was very morally opposed to slavery, and he once said, "I hate slavery as much as any abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, or doesn't matter. I hate it. I am morally opposed to slavery." But he sometimes, particularly early on, said things that today sound quite conservative and backward, but he was struggling to get ahead politically and strategizing, particularly in Illinois early on and so forth, and even during his presidency sometimes. So he had to sort of behave a little more conservatively than he actually felt morally and inwardly.
Right. And that shows up now in the way people talk about Lincoln, mostly on the question of race. That there's no question, I don't think any historian can seriously question that he hated slavery, that he as he himself once said, "I have always hated slavery." Just before he said, as much as any abolitionist, "I've always hated it." So that, and he grew up, as you know, his family was part of an anti-slavery church, and things like that. So we have no reason to doubt, not to take him at his word, that he always hated slavery. But race is a different thing. Nowadays, people have a difficult time separating the question of slavery from the question of race. And in the middle of the 19th century, one of the things that Lincoln and the Republicans were actively trying to do was say, let's leave this question of race aside. It's about slavery. The issue is slavery. You can see that, for example, in his debates with Stephen Douglas. Douglas kept on wanting to talk about race. Lincoln wanted to talk about slavery, right? But historians trip over themselves on this question of Lincoln and race. And one of the things that you do and can do, given the kind of scholar that you are, that so few people can do, is place his views about race in the context of a larger culture. So why don't you talk about that a little bit, and in particular, the kind of the significance you attribute to this cartoon character, Petroleum V. Nasby?
Yeah, well, early on, I mentioned earlier that he said a few kind of conservative things and almost racist things in his debates with Stephen Douglas. But Douglas kept on. Douglas was a thoroughgoing racist.
Yeah,
and Frederick Douglass said that Stephen Douglas did more harm to African American people than just about anybody. I mean, he was, and he kept on, for all these debates, he kept on, forcing the issue. And Lincoln finally said, he was speaking in Illinois, which at the time had this law that went into effect in 1853. That Frederick Douglass called the worst black law of any state in the Union, the so-called Negro Exclusion Act, which if you were a free African American, you couldn't enter for more than 10 days or else you'd be fined and you'd be kicked out of the state. It was a terrible kind of environment. And you can cherry pick certain things there. But then later on during his presidency, he really gains quite deep respect and affection. Even in Springfield, he lived in a neighborhood, this is back in Illinois, a neighborhood that was full of African Americans. He became friendly to them, and he kept corresponding with several of them while he was in the White House. And then while he was in the White House, he Frederick Douglass, who at first thought he was quite conservative on slavery, met him a couple of times in the White House and really was astounded. And he came out of there saying, "This is the least prejudiced white person I think I've ever met." And the same thing with Sojourner Truth. She was an older African-American feminist. And she came, she said, "Before I die, I want to meet this guy, this president, Abraham Lincoln." She came, she had a delightful delightful time with him and felt very, very close to him. And Martin Delaney, who was we would call him beyond Black Lives Matter. He was like a black nationalist. I mean, he was really, very militant. And he became, at the end of the war, Lincoln appointed him the highest appointed Army officer. And he didn't get to serve very much because the war was almost over. But when he became rather close to Lincoln, and when Lincoln died, he just cried for like half a day. He was just totally devastated. Martin Delaney was, and he proposed a monument to Lincoln that would be an African-American woman kneeling. Can you think of that? Not even a monument of Lincoln himself, a woman, just with 4 million tears coming out of her eyes, and each tear being paid for by a penny from each of the enslaved 4 million enslaved people. So that, on a personal level, he was very, very close. And he also grew to respect African Americans in the Civil War, the way they fought. If you've seen the movie Glory, you have a sense of the Fort Wagner battle, but there were many other battles in which they fought with the same devotion, sometimes even more energy and self-sacrifice than white people did. So he really, really, really admired that. But he also relied to a great degree on Petroleum Nasby, who was a popular humorist who was fighting the war on race on the cultural front. And Nasby impersonated the Copperheads, who were the opponents. They were the conservative Democrats. Back then, the Democrats were mainly conservative, at least on the issue of slavery and race. And so Nasby impersonated the Copperheads. And today it's hard for us to read this humor because it's full of the N word. But all he was doing when Nasby used that word, and he used it over and over again, was just miming or impersonating these racist Copperheads. And people would laugh about this. And a lot of people, several people said Nasby was just as great a force as Sherman or Grant in defeating slavery because he was so popular. And Lincoln would carry in his jacket the Nasby papers, the sketches by Nasby, and would pull them out and read them. And he once said, I would give up my presidency if I could just write like this guy. So it shows how deep his hatred of racism was, because Nasby really makes these Copperheads look very, very ugly and really disgusting. And it's almost as though Saturday Night Live skits, let's say against whoever, a political figure, were accepted as a huge cultural force. I think today we're so dispersed in our culture that it's hard to have one, kind of a single humorist or something to kind of have the force that Nasby, who was this real bestseller and so forth back then. So it's a little more dispersed today, but still same idea.
Yeah, it made me think of something. It had often seemed to me that most of the time when Lincoln uses the N-word, he is doing what you're describing Nasby is doing. He tends to use it in a way that's satirical by putting it in the mouth of his opponents, right? And it made me wonder, when did Nasby start writing this stuff? Because Lincoln was doing that already by the mid to late 1850s, like that. But it's true. It's the way you undermine the racist argument is by caricaturing it and stereotyping it, and that means it's in a way that it's almost Mel Brooksy, right? But I'm not sure you can get away with that today, because the culture is very different right now.
Yeah, it's a different culture. I don't, when I first encountered Nasby, his humor in the newspapers, because I read a lot of old newspapers, I said, this person, frankly, is very disgusting. It's so offensive. I can't read this. And then I suddenly this guy is being funny. I said, yeah, he is disgusting. He's totally appalling. And I suddenly realized, and he was criticizing Lincoln left and right. But what happened is that David Ross, his real name was David Ross Locke. That was his real name. Nasby was just a pseudonym. Locke had met Lincoln back in the 50s. And I almost think that Lincoln, in his sort of, as you say, satirical use of that word, sort of impersonating Stephen Douglas during the debates might have actually influenced Nasby in this sense, because Nasby had never written that way. I mean, Locke had never written that way before, and he had a long interview with Lincoln, because he overheard several of the debates and would follow Lincoln around. He was a reporter at that time, and he met him in his hotel room, and they were discussing Stephen Douglas at great length, and Locke detested Stephen Douglas. And I wouldn't be surprised that he heard Lincoln impersonating, and maybe because it was like 2 years later, and that he comes out with the first Nasby sketch. And the first Nasby sketch, one of the first ones is Petroleum visits Lincoln in the White House. So I mean, there's that kind of direct connection from the very, very beginning. But yeah, I it could be a case where I think that Lincoln, who had a sense of humor anyway, and used his humor against Douglas, might have prompted something,
Right. Well, there is a minor strain in anti-slavery political culture that does that. There's a famous exchange on the Senate floor between William Seward, the leading Republican of the day, and Stephen Douglas, in which everyone knew Stephen Douglas they were both actually angling for the presidency in 1860. And Seward says to Douglas, he belittles the idea that he could possibly be elected president on the grounds that no one could be elected president who spells the word Negro with 2 G's.
Yeah, right.
So they belittle
right.
it.
Yeah,
right? They belittle that kind of thing. Nevertheless, we're catching Lincoln as he is, especially in the late 1850s, becoming increasingly appalled by the explosion of demagogic racism, and particularly for him because he's in Illinois facing someone who is arguably the most influential racist demagogue. But unlike what we can say about Lincoln's views about slavery, which were consistently hostile right from the very beginning, he does grow.
I think he does grow. I think
on
he
the
does.
issue of slavery, on race. Right? When he was in the legislature in the 1830s, he introduced a suffrage bill that would give the right to vote to all white men and exclude black men. Right? And yet, as you point out correctly in your book, he, at the end of his life, one of the very last speech he gives, right? He's the first president to publicly endorse giving blacks the right to vote. Right?
Yeah, and
he's grown dramatically over time.
He's grown a lot, and sadly, of course, John Wilkes Booth was in the audience, and he says, that means, and he used the N-word, I don't prefer to use it, citizenship. I'm going to put this man through, and
and that's the last speech.
Three days later,
right?
he killed him. Yeah.
Right.
Booth was a white supremacist from Maryland and so forth. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, he slowly. I think he did progress. I think I agree with you. I agree with Eric Foner in that sense, and certain others that he does progress. And by 1864, he's already sending a letter in which he says, I think we should have at least limited suffrage for African American. Back then, it meant African American males because women did not get the vote until 1920. But still, he was really the first, and then the first one publicly to actually come out for his first president. Yeah.
Publicly endorsed. Right.
Yeah,
That's a big change. The other thing that I think I want to stick on this subject because it's an important subject in today's discussions about Lincoln. Despite some of those remarks you mentioned, and the one in Charleston where he said, I do not now and never have supported blacks serving on juries, black voting. That was the worst statement really he ever made about me. Despite that, most of what Lincoln had to say about race, especially in the 1850s when he becomes an anti-slavery after 1854, and he leaps back into politics as an anti-slavery politician. Most of what he had to say about race was egalitarian. right from the beginning in the Peoria speech. He says,
Yeah,
if the Negro is a man, my old faith tells me all men are created equal. And he
right.
says that over and over again. In the right to the bread she earns from the sweat of her brow, the black woman is my equal, and Stephen Douglas is equal and the equal of any living man. He says those things over and over and over again. Whereas you have to, when people talk about him as a racist, they pick this one or two quotations out that are clearly driven by the incredibly demagogic racism that is being thrown at him by Stephen Douglas. So
Yeah, and I put him in his culture in the 1850s because there were the reason that Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin made such an impact. It was a fairly simple thing. It showed that enslaved people were human beings with real feelings, with family feelings, with religious feelings, with a sense of humor, with a love of music. And I mean, today to us, that sounds very old fashioned or something to think about that. But enslaved people were being treated as things, as property, as
legally
animals.
property, right?
Yeah, legally they were property. They weren't really human beings. And all of this was supported by the pseudoscience, the ethnographic pseudoscience of that era, which some of which said that African people were of a different species and so forth. Or
polygenesis.
Polygenesis, and there was some of that going on. And it was all kind of pseudoscientifically and even religiously supported by supposedly the curse of Ham in the Bible and all of that stuff. And Lincoln cuts right through that in the Peoria speech and says, these are humans, enslaved people are our fellow human beings. And even to say that, he doesn't go on and on about it, but he says that's my fundamental point of view. And in a sense, he doesn't, even though he progresses, he doesn't really move beyond that basic fundamental understanding of the humanity of enslaved people and of black people. Yeah.
I think that's right. Let me ask you before we see if there are any questions. Has your view of Lincoln changed over the years? Did it change as you were writing this book?
It did change a lot because I had read the wonderful biographies by other people, but because they are what I call standard biographies, they follow his life facts and everything. They were all very interesting and important. I really thought that in a way he was like a star in the heavens. Walt Whitman wrote a poem saying that Lincoln will always be the Western star in the landscape. And that's the way I viewed him, as kind of distanced and kind of doing his own thing. And I was surprised and thrilled by the fact that he was so incredibly involved in his culture. And what I try to do in my book is weave it like a tapestry. I try not to get too lost in the cultural digressions. I like to always bring it back to Lincoln, because he's really at the center of my book. And so that was a wonderful surprise for me. It really was. Yeah.
I had a similar sense that when I first started thinking about Lincoln, I had this sense, like you said, he was out there, but I couldn't place him. And my interest was in his relationship to political anti-slavery politics. And the more I studied him, the more it seemed to me he was embedded in what turned out to be a much deeper, richer culture of anti-slavery politics and anti-slavery than I had ever thought about.
If I can give people a hint, you in your forthcoming book, you anchor him very, very deeply in that anti-slavery constitutional point of view in a wonderful way. But yeah.
So I could go on. I have. Well, let me ask one last question before we go to the questions about Lincoln's private life. You have what I think is a very sensible, sensitive, even-handed view of Lincoln's marriage to Mary Todd Stewart. But you also have a very interesting way of one hand saying this was the very picture of 19th century domesticity. On the other hand, it was also very different from the typical kind of marriage. In what ways was it different or representative? This is marriage.
Right. Well, it was different in the sense that American culture back then was quite patriarchal, and women, when they married, they gave up their property. There was this thing called coverture, by which, in a way, women gave up their independent identity and women were absorbed into their husbands. And that's part of the reason why Seneca Falls Convention happens in 1848 to protest coverture and the exclusion of women and so forth. But Mary Todd Lincoln was, in a sense, domestic. She called herself very domestic, and she took care of the kids and all of that. But she is very independent-minded, and she was not afraid of expressing her political opinions. And as parents, they were kind of unusual because they didn't really, back then, people in general punished their kids a lot, but they really gave their kids quite a lot of latitude. I mean, there were certain limits, to be sure, but Lincoln would be in his law office and his boys would come in and upset the inkstands and scatter the ashes and break the pens. And his law partner, William Herndon, said, if his kids, and he used the S word, S-H-I-T, sat in his hat, Lincoln would rub it on his boots and he would approve of it. He, would love it. And he admitted he had but he said, there's time enough for them to get pokey and old and everything. Let them have fun. Let them enjoy themselves. And the oldest one, who used to be a prankster, turned out to be rather a stuffy man. He became quite pokey. Two others, unfortunately, died. Willie died while Lincoln was in the White House, and Tad died at age 18. But Tad was very mischievous and used to come in during cabinet meetings and climb on Lincoln's shoulders and everything like that. But another very unconventional thing was the fact that during the law years, when they lived in Springfield, Lincoln was away for almost half of the year because he was on the law circuit. Back then, the little towns did not have lawyers. So Lincoln and a bunch of other lawyers had to go to these little towns. It was about the size of Connecticut, the circuit. And so he was gone about 120 days a year. So that was a little unconventional. They had big spaces in their togetherness. And in a way, it sort of developed a sense of independence on the part of Mary Todd Lincoln and even on the part of Abe Lincoln. Quite unusual in many respects.
Right. So there are some questions. Some of them I think you or I could answer very quickly, and so I'll just run through those before we get to those that take a little more time. One is, this comes up because of the presidential debate last week. Is there any evidence that Lincoln in October 1864 was willing to let the winner of the November 8th election appoint Todd successor? My sense is that there's no evidence whatsoever for that. Congress without time, and there was no reason he would have even made a nomination until December. So my sense is that it never came up.
No, it didn't come up. I will say that he had written in August, before that September, he had written a note saying, it kind of looks like I'm going to lose.
Right.
And he wrote a note to his cabinet and he sealed it in an envelope. And he said, it appears, because at that time the war was going very badly. Right. And I just want to have a fair election, but also a smooth transition of power here. It's to my successor. He assumed he was going to lose. So, but no, we really don't know about the Supreme Court thing. No.
Right.
No.
Another one, did he keep a diary of any kind? No, unfortunately, he didn't keep a diary of any kind. Even the diligent researches of Michael Burlingame has not found. He finds every source there.
He does.
Here's one. There are some more in-depth ones later, but what's your opinion of Daniel Day-Lewis's portrayal of?
Well, it's the first time in my life I began to believe in guns. because when I heard later that he was going to quit acting and retire, that I am going to get the nearest, I'm going to go buy a gun and say, you are not allowed to retire. Sorry. No, I was stunned. I loved it. I mean, the film, okay, takes a little latitude here and there. We all know that, but no, I think he did a really great job. Yeah.
I had the same thing. I was surprised. I was
Yeah.
surprised by it. I never would have imagined someone could get Lincoln.
Yeah.
Spectacle as he
Don't
did.
worry, I don't really believe in guns, but
Right. I know. This one, how would you describe Lincoln's leadership style? It's a big question that lots of people talk about.
his leadership style was relaxed, casual, but at the same time could be very, very firm, extremely firm. At the beginning of the war, just before the war broke out, 6 or 7 people around him said, we have to strike a compromise here. Let them take Fort Pickens and let them take this fort. And that. He said, no, if they fire on Fort Sumter, it's war. It's war. And they fired on Fort Sumter, and he called up 75,000 troops. It was war. And he kept another good thing about him was that he managed to negotiate with people on kind of a friendly level, even people like McClellan, who ended up being very, very ineffective on the battlefield. He managed to finesse that relationship enough so he could work his way through his generals, and he finally fires McClellan. He hires Burnside. He doesn't work out. He hires Hooker. He doesn't work out. But then he lights upon Grant, and Grant is his bulldog. So he allowed himself to kind of sort through very wisely his generals and to think about strategies of war. And he realized that war could no longer be fought with what he called squirt guns full of rose water. Sadly, it had to be a hard war. It had to be a hard war. And Grant and Sherman were the 2 people, and he finally ends up with them, and they indeed, and a few other generals like them under them, finish off the Civil War. So I think he did a great job, and he also finessed his cabinet pretty well too, as Doris Kearns Goodwin notes in Team of Rivals and so forth. Yeah.
Well, the 2 things that strike me about it, that struck me again as I was reading your book, is that he came into his relationships with other people as the most powerful person without putting his ego on the line. He didn't. With McClellan, for example, McClellan was horrible to him, but he didn't care if McClellan was nasty and said awful things about him behind his back, as long as McClellan would fight.
Yeah, and even his cabinet, Salmon Chase always felt superior to him.
Right.
And someone at the beginning of the war said, you're going to hire Salmon Chase as your Secretary of the Treasury? Right. Listen, President Lincoln, he feels so much more superior to you. You can't believe it. He says, oh, really? That's exactly the kind of person I want around me. He didn't want personal loyalty. He wanted loyalty. Salmon Chase was incredibly progressive and
and disloyal.
Yeah, and disloyal as well, because he tried to supplant Lincoln. And yet Lincoln didn't hold hard feelings, and he is the one who ultimately ends up on the Supreme Court after that election. So even after he fires Salmon Chase, and he knows that Salmon Chase tried to replace him in 1860, he knows all of that, but he didn't hold any sense of personal disloyalty.
As long as Chase was doing a good job, which he was doing a good job as Secretary of the Treasury under very difficult circumstances, Lincoln didn't care about the ego stuff.
Absolutely.
And the other thing he didn't let get in the way was ideology. And you do a very nice job of showing how when the radical Republicans were sort of demanding that he only hire anti-slavery generals and things like that, he would say, look, no, I hire generals. What I want in a general is someone who will fight and win battles. And if they fight and win battles, I don't care if it's a Democrat. I don't care if it's even a Copperhead. I care, and if a radical general like, let's say, Fremont can't do it, I'm going to fire him.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even Grant had said before, I'm not a Lincoln man in the Douglas Lincoln Douglas debates and so forth, and yet Grant was like his favorite general. He got the job done, and same with Sherman. Sherman was, frankly, quite racist and believed.
Yeah,
he thought that. Frankly, African Americans were better off as enslaved people, So, and yet Sherman, whatever, he was a wonderful general in Georgia and the Carolinas. So yeah.
There's a couple of really remarkable notes that he writes to the general. He writes that amazing note to Hooker when he hires Hooker and says, I have heard in ways that
you want to be a dictator.
Leave me to believe are accurate that you called for a dictator. Well, only generals who win battles can be dictators. I'll risk, you win battles and I'll risk a dictatorship. It's a wonderful letter.
And yet he hires Hooker, Hooker said, I want to be a dictator.
Right. And the one he writes to Grant after Vicksburg is classical. So when he says, look, I wasn't sure you could do this. I didn't really believe in the strategy. I just want to go on record as saying that I was wrong and you were right.
Yeah, he says, I was wrong. Sorry, I was wrong. He really didn't let ego get in his way.
Yeah. No. Right. Or ideology. That's right. Those I think are crucial to understanding his capacity as a leader. So let's take one last question, because this is a big one and people like us always get this question. How would Reconstruction have been had Lincoln lived? How would it have been different?
Well, now we get into counterfactual history. Right. My belief, and Jim, I don't know if you agree with me. Well, he certainly would have handled it much better than Andrew Johnson did, much better. And I believe that he would have wanted to support the Freedmen's Bureau and support the idea of 40 acres and a mule. He was such a belief in free labor. I think he would have tried to encourage the advance of formerly enslaved people, their advance both politically and economically. And I think when push came to shove, when you had the resurgence of these kind of white supremacist groups, I think he would have put his foot down fairly firmly at that point. I firmly believe that. What's your feeling about that, Jim?
Well, it's as you say, it's all counterfactual. Obviously, there would have been a lot less drama between the White House and the president, because whatever Lincoln's racial views, he was not a hardcore racist the way Andrew Johnson was.
Yeah.
So as you say, I don't know about the 40 acres and a mule. He never expressed himself in favor of land redistribution, and it was a little bit outside the mainstream of Republican Party politics. Thaddeus Stevens supports it.
Right.
Even that Sherman order that everybody talks about, if you read the order carefully, it's very clear this is a contingent. Contingent grants of land. He can't actually give the land outright. Be simple.
Right.
But I doubt if he would have done what Johnson did and just simply peremptorily forced them all off the land, all the people who had gotten land.
Yeah, and yet he had signed the Homestead Act, which it wasn't exactly a giveaway of land, but it was almost a giveaway of land to enterprising people who would go into the Western territories and settle. Right. Now, eventually, of course, that was taken over by a lot of the railroads, and that kind of went to hell later on. But still, he had the concept, I think. You're right, probably 40 acres and a mule was a little too much. And that was like a metaphor just I was using for the advance of the formerly enslaved people. Yeah.
Right. Whether it, in the long run, whether it would have changed very much, it's hard to say, because, John Hope Franklin once wrote in his wonderful little book on Reconstruction that, just in passing, he says that sooner or later, the federal government was going to leave the South, and control in the South was going to go back to white electoral majorities, and there wasn't, and so whether it would have turned out all that different in the end is hard to say, because eventually he would have not been president, and Grant may have been president in 1868 again to 72, 76, but it might have stayed more or less the same till then, with again less drama, no impeachment or anything like that. But whether it would have changed things in the long run is hard for me to say.
Yeah, I think the best that could have happened is he would have set a good example.
Right.
But this resurgence, the ultimate redemption of the Southerners and all of that, and the disengagement of the federal government and so forth, I think that would have happened. And maybe Jim Crow would have been a few years shorter or something. I'm not sure. But
well, let me give you an alternative scenario. Given Lincoln's common touch, given his long-standing belief that there was a majority in the South that was hostile to the slaveholding class, it's not hard for me to imagine that the Republican Party would have had an easier time with him as president, building that biracial coalition that the Republicans were trying to build after the war ended, and that may have turned out very quickly.
May have made a difference. Certainly in the longer run back then. Right. Maybe not in the ultimate long run.
Right.
The early 20th century and birth of a nation and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, this has been great, David. We've reached the end of our time, and I want to thank you again for asking me to do this.
Thank you, and I hope that all the viewers will, my book is on Amazon, and
right, buy it. It's terrific. Congratulations again on this wonderful achievement. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's been great.
Great. Thanks a lot, David. Bye. Good night.
Good night.